It's time to join Montana's very own and your voice for agriculture, Talkin' Ag Lane Nordland, for today's Lanecast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Lanecast Ag Podcast. Today we're out of the studio. We're in San Diego attending the cattle industry summer business meeting. Yes, should I be at home haying? Yes, I should be, but I'm down here reporting, doing my main job that pays the bills when I try to be a rancher back at home. But I'm looking forward to sharing the conversations that we had down here, particularly around fake meat, lab-grown meat, the petri dish proteins that, of course, cattle producers are very concerned with. We're going to have an update on that. And also the Chevron Deference. That was a recent Supreme Court ruling. How does that impact farmers and ranchers out in the countryside? That's what we are going to discuss today with some experts from here in San Diego. Stay tuned. We look forward to joining us here on the Lanecast Ag Podcast. Well, as the cattle industry summer business meeting took place in San Diego, California, a lot of key issues being discussed with cattlemen and women from across the nation, and I call it petri dish protein, PDPs, or lab-grown meat, fake meat. That's kind of been your portfolio of our guest today. Sigrid Johannes joins us, and Sigrid, you work in the DC office with NCBA. What is it like discussing fake meat, lab-grown proteins with elected leaders, agency officials out in our nation's capital?
You know, it's pretty interesting, Lane, because we got to keep in mind we're talking to a broad audience. You have your people who pick up, their preferred traditionally raised protein every time they go to the grocery store, and then we've got plenty of people who are vegans and vegetarians and have strong opinions about what other Americans should be eating. But what I have found very interesting is that no matter what angle people are coming at it from, they have a ton of questions about this product, and there's a lot of confusion still.
So what are some of those key questions you have from a staff member or a member of Congress when it comes to really educating, but there's a lot of confusion out there?
A lot of it focuses on safety, which I think is appropriate. That's where we need to start. Is this a safe and wholesome product to be putting, in grocery stores and potentially on restaurant plates? And a lot of that goes down to lack of transparency and lack of awareness about how these products are actually made. You've got cells, sometimes fetal bovine serum, and some other ingredients, so to speak, that go into bioreactors in a nutrient-dense liquid. Doesn't that sound appetizing?
Yeah, a fetal bovine serum sounds pretty good too.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody's eager to get their hands on that, but it's just, they replicate like a tumor. They're genetically engineered in many cases to duplicate endlessly, and then once they've got enough, they kind of scoop it together, harvest it, and fashion it into whatever type of meat they're trying to imitate. But not many Americans know about that process, and I think once you tell them what this actually looks like, that appetite goes way down.
Well, and I find it so interesting because consumers, there's been so many trends moving away from ultra-processed foods and whatnot, going towards different food items, and this is a very ultra-processed food, especially when you're looking at alternative proteins that are made with other types of products. But when you're looking at lab-grown too, it just, I don't know. I raise real beef out in my pasture. I know what I'm going to have, but I really am concerned about consumers being misinformed.
You're absolutely right. It's a highly processed product, and I think the other thing that's very interesting is there's a lot of microplastics involved in this, and that's something we've seen a ton of consumers start to pay much more attention to in their diet, in the toiletry products they use. There's all kinds of folks who are very concerned about that now and about that transference of microplastics into the bloodstream. These cells are literally grown on plastic scaffolds in the bioreactor. I would find it very hard to believe that none of that is making its way into the final product.
So as we're here at the summer business meeting, what are some of the discussions taking place? What are the current policies surrounding NCBA's policy towards advocating for real beef and labeling? I guess what's that world like right now, and what does the policy read for NCBA currently?
Yeah, so our current policy book specifies NCBA's support for very clear labeling on these products. We want the words cell cultured to be on there. We want imitation to be on the package, right in big, clear, legible letters, so that consumers know exactly what they're picking up when they go into the grocery store. We've also got an increasing number of members and producers from around the country who are looking at the funding going towards these products, and that's a big area of concern for them right now. So this is really valuable to get that feedback here at meetings like we're having in San Diego, because we're headed into yet another chaotic appropriation cycle. And so we'll be looking at, what goes to grants in various departments, different parts of the government that put out grants for types of technology. Cell cultured meat, we don't think needs to be one of the recipients for those taxpayer dollars. They're very well funded by folks like Jeff Bezos already. They certainly don't need tax dollars to figure out how to commercialize their product. But I think those are the key things we've heard from members this week, is labeling and how are they being funded. And, we stand by consumer choice. We think when people are given all the facts, they're still going to choose real beef, but we need to make sure they have all the facts.
Well, and when you look at that specifically, I think the impact that the dairy industry has seen on the what I want to call mislabeling of other products that are non-dairy, like almond milk and soy milk, and in my opinion, milk comes from a mammal.
Yep.
And I look to our friends to the north in Canada. I know there's not always agreements on everything between the U.S. and Canada on things, but they have it labeled as almond drink and soy drink, because I think consumers can be impressed upon with marketing schemes and whatnot. But I think it should become almond drink here in the U.S. But I guess, how is the beef industry and the cattle industry looking at that example? It's a poor example, but how is the beef industry looking at that in the labeling to say, hey, we can't go down the road that dairy went down with almond?
No, absolutely. It's a good playbook, a good test case for us to look at. And I think there's a few components to this. We're a little bit hamstrung in our regulatory scheme in ways that Canada, it's interesting that you mentioned them, they're a perfect example of a country that has a label and has a regulatory process, approval process for so-called novel foods or novel technologies. That's something you see in a lot of other countries that we actually don't really do in the United States. So that's the first kind of, I would say, ding that makes it tougher to distinguish these products when you get into the grocery store. But what we can control is what's on the label. And so when we push for words like imitation product, imitation beef, imitation meat, cell cultured, making it clear that it's derived from cell cultured ingredients, that's really where we focus on trying to not lose that real estate, not lose that ground. Because when they say beef on the package, they're trading on our good reputation. They're trading on people's perceptions of the product, the quality, the taste, the high degree of trust that consumers, report in farmers and ranchers. Our cattle producers in the United States are very respected and a very, admired group of people by even people who don't know a lot about agriculture. So we want to make sure that when they have that word on the label, we're trying to get them to stop using beef. But if they're going to say beef on the label, it sure as heck has to say lab-grown, cell-cultured imitation product, so people know exactly what they're getting.
Well, and I would say maybe we're going to see something in the Farm Bill doing this, but we don't know what the Farm Bill's going to be at this point.
If we see the Farm Bill pass the finish line, I think that would be the first piece of news. Now, we're likely going to see another extension on the Farm Bill this year. I think that's just the reality of the Congress we're in right now, and kind of the very far apart points that we've seen the House and the Senate start from. We were very supportive of Congressman G.T. Thompson's bill. I think it's a great one, but when you look over at the Senate and Senator Stabenow's version is a little bit of a mixed bag. So we've got a ways to go there, but I think looking for opportunities in the appropriations process for some of our standalone bills like the Fair Labels Act, School Lunch Integrity Act, just making sure that we're covering all our bases and ensuring that this lab-grown product is not on the plates of anybody who's, participating in a government program in public schools, anything like that.
Well, what's just a tidbit you'd like to share with the cattlemen and women tuning in today about how they can do their part in helping educate others about real beef and the importance of correct labeling when it comes to these imitator products?
I think always stay engaged with your congressmen and women. That never hurts. They want to hear from their constituents. They want to hear what you think about these labeling bills. The Fair Labels Act is one you can point to specifically that NCBA is supportive of. But I think even on a person-to-person basis, just talking about what you do every day, sharing your story, talking about how you raise your cattle, that makes an enormous difference to people. And when when consumers are surveyed, the number one factor that they look at when they're thinking about meat, real meat versus alternatives, is animal welfare. It's actually not environmental sustainability, which a lot of people think it is. So I think talking about how well you raise your cattle, all the steps you go through to minimize, illness, to minimize stress, all of the things that you're doing without even really, it comes naturally to you when you're running your business. But a lot of people want to know about that, and a lot of people don't know all the work that goes into it. So sharing that makes a difference.
Well, Sigrid, thanks for joining us here today, and appreciate filling our audience in on PDPs.
Thank you, Lynn.
Hey, if you use PDP, you gotta give me credit.
I will trademark it.
Petri dish proteins. So, again, friends, we're gonna have more conversations here in the Lanecast Ag Podcast. But first, these words from our sponsors.
Ready for a real PRF partner?
He was willing to track us for a year and provide that data back to us for a year. That's a guy making a pretty big investment.
At Ag Risk Advisors, this isn't our first rodeo. We are one of the most experienced in pasture rangeland forage. Honesty, commitment, trust. Many companies use these words. At Ag Risk Advisors, we earn them.
Well, as we come back to the Lanecast Ag Podcast today, we are in San Diego, California. We have the bay just behind us. Actually, it's a big dole ship. There's a lot of fruit getting brought up into the United States here today. But we've seen a lot coming up from the U.S. Supreme Court here this summer. Joining us here today is Chief Counsel for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Mary Thomas Hart. And Mary Thomas, how is San Diego here so far?
Oh man, nice and sunny and not DC. So it's really nice to be on the West Coast.
Yeah, I mean, it's cooler here than back in Montana. It went from like nice 78-degree weather last week to mid-90s.
Yeah.
My hay's drying out, and I need to get it cut and get home and try to be a cowboy, at home there. But obviously, it's hot and swampy out in DC all the time. But obviously, a lot of headlines coming out here this summer in terms of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. The Chevron Deference, which, if you're reading that really fast, sometimes you might say deference wrong. I know I definitely screwed up saying that on radio and TV. But I know when I was in college in natural resources law classes and undergrad, we learned a lot about the Chevron Deference. And for our viewers joining us here today, can you walk us through what that was, and then ultimately what the High Court ruled here just a few weeks ago?
Of course, yeah, and thanks for having me on. So about 40 years ago, or exactly 40 years ago, the Supreme Court considered a case called Chevron versus the Natural Resources Defense Council. And it was a case about regulation of the oil and gas industry under the Clean Air Act. And in that decision, 40 years ago, the Supreme Court determined that EPA and other administrative agencies are deferred to, we defer to their expertise when two conditions are present. First, when the statute written by Congress or the law written by Congress is vague or ambiguous. And then secondly, when the agency makes a quote unquote reasonable interpretation of that vague or ambiguous language. So that's all that has to happen under Chevron doctrine for an agency to basically be able to do whatever it wants, right? And I think the Supreme Court in 1984 wrote that decision with a well-meaning intent, certainly didn't realize what Chevron was going to evolve or devolve into. But over the last 40 years, we saw a pretty steep increase in regulatory rulemaking and regulatory policy making. And because the legislative branch really didn't have to do much work anymore because it could rely on regulatory agencies to make the tough calls, I think we saw an equal decrease in legislating. So it led to this real kind of outbalanced or unbalanced federal policy-making structure that the Supreme Court, in its Loper-Bright decision a couple weeks ago, attempted to correct.
So what were some of the what were some of the key things that the justices pointed out and referred to when making that new decision?
Yeah, so the facts of the case, I think, are really interesting, and have nothing to do with agriculture, but I think show just how broad this decision is going to be, and how far-reaching the impacts of the decision are going to be. So in this case, we're actually talking about a group of herring fishermen off the coast of New Jersey, who have always been required to have an inspector, a federal inspector, on their ship. But in 2020 and 2021, the Department of Transportation mandated that those fishermen pay for their own inspector instead of it being a government contractor or a government employee. Those fishermen sued the federal government, saying that, we're not always guaranteed that we're going to get a paycheck when we go out to sea. We have no idea what we're going to catch. It's completely unfair for you to force us to pay an inspector when we may not even get any pay. So that's the source of this case. And the question was, did Congress tell the Department of Transportation how to set up these pay structures? Did the DOT kind of go out above and beyond what statute mandated of them? And so in this decision, I think we saw a very clear vacatur or outlawing of the Chevron doctrine. It's actually not something that the Supreme Court has cited to since 2016. They recognized that it's been abused by federal agencies, but I think they did realize that they needed to kill it once and for all, and so that's exactly what happened.
So when we circle back around to agriculture, specifically for the livestock industry, obviously jumping into mind, we have EPA and BLM. Those are just two agencies and departments that jump into my mind. So I guess when we're applying this to the livestock industry, how is it a win, and how is this going to be maybe easier for producers to make a go of it out on the landscape?
I'll use an example of Chevron's abuse and how it negatively impacted producers in the past, and then maybe kind of forward-looking how we could expect to see the impact of not having Chevron in the equation anymore. So, I think when we look at the last 40 years, and I use this stat a lot, and we've talked about WOTUS a good bit, but if you've owned land since 1970, you've dealt with 14 different regulatory iterations of a WOTUS definition. That's not an accident, and that is a direct consequence of Chevron deference. Because the EPA had the power and the deference to interpret and reinterpret and reinterpret the definition of WOTUS, producers and landowners across the country were constantly subject to this changing and evolving definition and regulatory standard. It created very little regulatory certainty. And I think that when you think about the long-term impact of Chevron and agency deference, it means a real lack of regulatory certainty. So if you flip that on its head and you pull back Chevron deference, there should be a pretty equal increase in regulatory certainty. So that's, I think, going to apply across the board, regardless of if we're talking about EPA regulation, Department of Interior. But one of the things that comes to mind, I think, that's incredibly relevant and present are packers and stockyards regulations, right? Those fair competition rules that were just proposed about a week and a half before the Chevron decision dropped. I think, USDA is going to not have the additional coverage of Chevron deference when it's writing and finalizing those rules. I suspect that they're going to have to take that proposal back to the drawing board to really firm it up, but if they even choose to finalize it at all, because they are more strictly bound by congressional intent.
Well, again, the legality of it can be so overwhelming for producers, and producers just want to raise cattle and beef out in the countryside. Yeah. So I guess from your perspective, and really being the lead on that out in DC and a voice for producers, I guess what's just something you would like to leave our audience members with here too, as we continue just to watch the legal issues that impact family producers?
I think that one more note on Chevron. A lot of people are concerned because they don't trust Congress to make technical standards that we, entrust to agency staff. And I don't think that's going to change. I think that agencies will continue to be in the lead when it comes to setting those technical standards. I don't want a random member of Congress to tell me how much nitrogen I can land apply, right? I need someone that's a scientist to make that determination. But I think what we're going to see shift is Congress making policies and setting policies, and then the administration or executive branch actually applying those policies. So leaving the policy makings to the legislators, leaving the technical decisions to the agencies, hopefully reestablishing separation of powers the way our founding fathers intended.
Well, it's all over my head, but I'm glad you're there explaining it and being a voice for producers in the countryside.
Thank you for having me.
Well, enjoy San Diego.
I will.
Well, friends, we appreciate you joining us here today on the Lanecast Ag Podcast. We talked fake meat, those Petri dish proteins, and of course that Chevron Deference. If you haven't done so, make sure and subscribe to the Lanecast Ag Podcast on YouTube or wherever you enjoy your podcast. Until next time, I'm Lane Nordland. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lanecast with Talkin' Ag, Lane Nordland. For more on Lane, check out his Facebook page, Lane Nordland Ag Broadcaster, and NordlandCommunications.com.